Sky reach 22, clear for takeoff.
Wellbeing, inclusion, diversity, equality, wide skies.
But where are you really from?
When you have been impacted by racism, you think about it all the time.
Racism is a difficult topic for many people in the UK and beyond. Following the murder of George Floyd in the USA, we saw increased public recognition that we have a fundamental problem, both there and in the UK. But acknowledging there's an issue is not enough. How do we have open and honest conversations to really recognise the imbalance in treatment of people based on their skin colour or heritage, and to do something to address that imbalance? Welcome to Wide Skies. I'm Martin York.
And I'm Debbie Watt.
It's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce you to our guests for this episode. Firstly, Anne-Marie Bainbridge. Anne-Marie is a passionate diversity and inclusion specialist with over 20 years' experience in a variety of organisations and sectors. She helps executives and senior leaders to create inclusive organisational cultures. She's increasingly been involved in helping individuals and organisations to move from being not racist to anti-racist, and this has involved difficult and challenging but very necessary conversations. Anne-Marie is also passionate about her membership of Anti-Racist Cumbria, which has a mission to make Cumbria the first anti-racist county in the UK. And our second guest is Nimerta Virdee. Nimerta is an educator, having taught in secondary schools and further education for 11 years, and now is part of the education team at Diversity Role Models, a charity that specialises in bringing LGBT+ inclusion to schools and colleges through the power of storytelling. She's also a member of the National Education Union and works with their Black Organising Forum to train members on how to foster and build anti-racism into our school and college communities. Welcome to both of you.
Welcome.
So if I could start the ball rolling by asking a question to both of you, and perhaps Anne-Marie, if I could come to you first. For those of us who haven't experienced racism, what insights could you share?
That's such a broad question. I suppose I would say that it's not just about the obvious. So it's not just about people shouting in the streets or being attacked. Not that that doesn't happen and that isn't awful, but actually it's often a lot more subtle than that. Mm-hmm. So it's the way people respond to you in various situations, both in your professional life and in your personal life. It's about how, accessing services, so getting jobs, accessing healthcare, housing. There are so many areas of our lives that racism can play a part, and it isn't always someone's going to call you the N-word or shout at you, or so it's much, as I said, much more subtle than that.
Nimerta, could I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I completely agree with Anne-Marie with that sort of kind of pervasiveness of it, that it's not just about the incidents, but it's the kind of ongoingness of it. And I'm brought to mind from a recent workshop on anti-racism that I was in from an organisation called Kids of Colour, and I remember the trainer actually said for a minute on how often do you think about race. And what occurred to me, and I kind of shared this with my little breakout group, was that when you have been impacted by racism, you think about it all the time, and you start thinking about it when you're a kid, and you carry on thinking about it all the time. And as Anne-Marie said, it's about everything. It's about your access to services, to healthcare, to getting jobs. Every time you don't get shortlisted for a job, you wonder, is it because of the name that I've put down on my application? And there's no way to prove it, but it's always there, just chipping away in the back of your mind, and it becomes incredibly internalized. And then that leads to, this is a sort of series on well-being, really, so it can really link itself to how that impacts your well-being and how you feel about who you are.
Definitely.
And perhaps if I could ask you first, Nimerta, how would you describe your heritage?
So I'm South Asian of Indian origin, a little bit more complex. And I do like to point this out, that so my family are ethnically Indian, but my mum was actually born in Myanmar, or it was called Burma at the time. So for a lot of people that aren't white British, our heritage is much more complex than just, black or Asian or even South Asian. There's a lot of complexity in there. But yes, South Asian Indian is how I would identify.
Anne-Marie, how about you? How would you describe your heritage?
So my parents were from Jamaica, but I was born here and grew up here. And just kind of linking to what Nimerta just said, it's quite an interesting thing because this question of are you British or are you, wherever you're from. I remember when I was about 14 or 15 being on holiday somewhere and somebody asked, where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm English.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, oh, yeah, but where are you really from?
That famous phrase.
So from a very early age, I would now describe myself as British, but I would never describe myself as English. That's impacted me from a very early age because how I read that question is you're not really English because you're not white.
Yeah.
So that sits in my psyche. So I'm British, but I'm Jamaican heritage.
Mine's really simplistic. I guess I would describe myself as being white British, and I have British heritage going back a number of years. I do sometimes describe myself as white European, but that's more of a political statement rather than a heritage statement. And how about you, Debbie?
I would describe myself as white British.
Thinking about behaviours that you get from majority group people, and I guess we're talking about stereotypically white people. What are some of the stereotypical behaviours that one might see if one is not white or not perceived as being white that happen?
That's an interesting one. I suppose I notice sometimes when people draw away from you a little bit, sometimes it can be very subtle. So my husband is white English. And sometimes we've been out and someone will respond in a particular way, very, very subtly, and I'll say that was a piece of racism. It's not always something that they say, but you just get it's almost like an instinct. So living in Carlisle now, which I love, by the way, I remember coming to do some work here about 20 years ago. And I remember walking down the street and there was a guy coming towards me, didn't say a word, but I could feel, I described it, I felt it as racism just emanating from him. Didn't say a single thing, but I could just feel it walking down the street.
But these are sort of microaggressions.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually live in the northeast of England now, but I grew up in London, which is sort of perceived as being quite a multicultural part of the world, certainly compared to the northeast of England. But interestingly, I grew up in the suburbs, which at the time was still pretty predominantly white. And there was a lot of, thinking of myself as a teen, a lot of jokes made at your expense. That sense of just being othered, it could be that little look that someone gives you, these microaggressions, or that general lack of being welcomed somewhere because you are different or you are perceived as being different. I talked about my mum earlier and my parents' heritage. So I'm British born as well. My parents came to the UK separately, with their own families, but as teenagers. So they've grown up in the UK since their teenage years, and they're very much kind of internalized in the sense that it's, this is a hostile country to people that aren't white. And my mum talks about not being shown houses when we were looking for a house to buy, not being shown houses in the nicer end of town because of not being white. And this is in the 90s, so it's not very long ago. So there's that. And I think some of the other behaviours that might come under microaggressions, I guess, that kind of spring to mind sort of more as an adult. And it's interesting moving up to the north. I absolutely love the northeast, and a few people did question me saying, would you not worry about there being racism in a part of the world that's less culturally diverse and ethnically diverse? But actually, people generally speaking are really, really nice and really kind. But there is a sense of, you often get that whole, well, I don't see race statement. I don't see it. Everyone's just everyone. I treat people equally. And that in and of itself can come across a bit racist because you're thinking, well, then I'm completely silenced here. I can't bring out things that I feel are a bit of a inequality. I mean, one example is the first place I worked in Newcastle. I was overwhelmingly aware of, I was a teacher and I was one of only 2 teachers of colour. We were both South Asian. There were no ethnically black teachers there. All the black staff were cleaners. And being able to raise that openly was an incredibly uncomfortable experience because people just didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to admit that there was a problem there. And again, time and time again, there was that excuse of where we treat people equally here. It's not our fault.
We don't see colour.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that phrase in particular, and Anne-Marie, I saw you smile when Nimerta said it. You and I, in a professional capacity, will have both experienced this many times when working with customers, where you have people that are hopefully intending to mean well, but in fact are completely missing the point.
Absolutely. When my mum came, she came first, and then my dad came after. But she wanted to find a church, and so she found one. They went to a service, and at the end of the service, they were coming out, and the vicar was standing by, shaking everyone's hand. And my dad put his hand out, and he saw my dad's hand, and he took his hand back. My dad never went to church again. And, that was in the 1960s, so it was probably more blatant.
Do you think things are getting better, or are there some areas where things are getting worse?
I can't decide if things are getting worse or it's just more open about them. It was always bad, and it's just more in your face, as it were. There are some things that have emboldened people, like Brexit, for example.
Oh, yes.
So it's giving people permission to express their views quite openly. It's worse in the sense of it's more in your face, but I think those feelings were always there.
Oh, I completely agree. I'm really brought to mind. So I was a teacher down in London when the Brexit vote, when that referendum happened. And in the months that led up to that, there were a lot of reports about increased xenophobia and increased racism, or incidents of racism. And I really deeply recall being sat in the staff room and having white colleagues acting and these are very sort of, anti-racist white colleagues, they were acting so shocked about the volume of the types of quite insidious incidents that were happening. And myself and a few other teachers of colour who were there were sort of, we explained, like, none of us are surprised because we used to see it all the time. It's just those people are now emboldened to the point that white allies are hearing it as well, but they didn't realise. And I kind of agree with you that it's hard to feel like, to a certain extent, I feel like things have got better kind of on a very surface level. Certainly with like the work that I do with diversity role models, I hear from schools that they've done a lot of work on cracking down on racist slurs. So like the incidence of kids using racist language in school may well be going down, but whether they're saying it in the community or whether it might be happening behind closed doors or just purely out of the earshot of educating staff.
We now have many more vehicles with which to connect to each other. So social media is an obvious one. And so it's very easy for people to galvanise an opinion and amplify it very quickly and to find target groups and use it against them. And I guess for certainly myself, I would like to be a white ally as much as I can, and I realise there is always more that I can do, and it requires activism as well as just saying that you're going to do things. But I'm always aware that because I'm not the target, I can never know how it feels, and I can never understand the extent of how often it happens. Do you think in some respects we're making the same mistakes that we've made before?
If I have an experience as a woman, or say, for example, with my age or my disability, something like that, if people witness it or you say, you relate what's happened, they can very easily say, oh yeah, I understand that, I can see that must be really terrible. But I think with racism, there's always a questioning and you're always having to justify. So it's always, I don't think they meant it like that. Are you sure? Aren't you being a bit oversensitive?
I feel what you're saying there about not being believed. I'm really brought to mind of a time where I won't go into details about it and certainly won't name names, but having conversations with colleagues who then told me that I had a chip on my shoulder and that what I was talking about wasn't actually racism, and this is, a group of white people kind of, being the dominant representatives in that conversation telling me I was wrong. And that happens time and time again. It's almost like it's okay for people to tell you that you're wrong, whereas I agree what you're saying, Anne-Marie, that as a woman, even as an LGBT activist, I don't really hear that in other spheres to the same degree. Probably that might just be my experience, though maybe others would feel differently. But in terms of are we making the same mistakes, I think the real issue is, and not to get too political with this, but I think the biggest barriers to having really, really in-depth and having those uncomfortable conversations is the lack of political will to do it.
Yeah.
And if I think about, so at the minute where we've just had the 75th anniversary of the partition of India and Pakistan, and as a British South Asian with Indian heritage, I didn't know anything about that history until the last sort of few years. I know when we had the 70th anniversary 5 years ago, there were some documentaries on TV, but they were very much kind of, with this kind of rose-tinted gaze of balancing out the bad with the good things that the British kind of empire did in India. And then this year I started watching some of the documentaries, and I watched some with my parents a few weeks ago, and they were heavy. And it was the first time I was hearing like the real truth of some of the very, very heavy divide and conquer politics that happened at that period in time.
We hear nothing.
Until we can tell these stories to a wider, not to have an echo chamber where the same anti-racist allies are talking to the same anti-racist allies. Until we go out into the communities where people just don't know this, we're not going to really get anywhere.
Do you know where I found out about Partition? Doctor Who had an excellent episode. And Ms. Marvel, I shouldn't be learning this stuff at my age, in my late 40s. Now, it was never taught in schools. I shouldn't have found out about it on Doctor Who.
Although I would say to that, and I don't disagree with anything that's been said, I do think that it's helpful when you get programs and films like that do normalise it and include it, because it encourages people to then say, I don't actually know about that. And I think the fact that we have Black History Month, we have South Asian Heritage Month that we've just been through recently as well, those are really important things. But as you said, Nimerta, it's the people that don't know about it that need to engage with this to learn more, and we all have a responsibility for learning. I just want to go back to microaggressions if I can, and the other thing that sometimes comes up in training that I do is about colorism. I'm sure there'll be a number of listeners that don't know what colorism is. Would one of you like to just go through a brief explanation of what we mean by colorism?
The origins of racism is the closer you are to white, the more acceptable you are. So if you're light-skinned, you're more acceptable than if you're darker-skinned. So lots of people who are darker skinned, particularly women actually, experience discrimination. It's quite pervasive. People who are not black or brown, they might not even recognise that that's what's happening, but you're just seen as more acceptable if you're lighter skinned, if you're more akin to the European ideal.
It's also very much been perpetuated through the fashion industry in recent years, hasn't it, as well?
Absolutely.
And the cosmetics industry, hair and cosmetics.
The use of Photoshop on images, it's continuously.
So I know this happens in India and also in Nigeria and some other places, and they sell a lot of skin bleaching creams.
Yeah,
because again it's aspiring to that European light-skinned look, and actually it's hugely damaging. Saying to people, you're not good enough unless you look like this. And as I said, particularly impacts on women.
It's literal erasure of somebody's heritage, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what you said about, the fact you started to be aware of this from a very, very young age. So, in your formative years, as you're coming into puberty, etc., you're thinking, I need to change myself. I need to be different.
Exactly. It's very, very pervasive.
And thinking about the perpetuated norms that if you're in a white majority position, that it may not just occur to you. Recently, I remember there being lots of media interest in the fact that there was one plaster company that had released a range of plasters in different skin tones. And it hadn't occurred to people before that they're always been designed for white people.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm very passionate about a guy called John Amici. He's very tall. He's a very dominant guy to look at physically. He's black, he's gay. And he talks about all of these things as part of intersectionality. And he came to do a speech, a keynote speech at an inclusion event that I'd organised at a previous employer. That was the first time that I'd met him. And I recall him telling stories in the keynote speech about the fact that people judging him as soon as they see him because he's this really big dominant character, and people would avoid him on the street. And after the event had finished, I went with him outside. It's central London, 2:00 in the afternoon, and he was trying to hail down a taxi cab, and they wouldn't stop. And I couldn't believe it. There he was, dressed in a three-piece suit, looking really smart. And so witnessing it firsthand, it really brought that reality to home for me.
I love John as well. And I think that being a black man, that's quite a powerful negative experience that they will have. It's almost like you have to make yourself, he's very tall, but it's almost like you have to make yourself small and non-threatening to navigate some of those spaces, those white spaces. You notice it more at certain times than others.
I've got a lot of cousins, and I'm described as one of the dark girls, basically, and that's by aunties and other people in my family. It's very, very normalized in particularly in Indian culture. And as you were saying, Anne-Marie, there's all these cosmetics and skin bleaching, and a lot of it it's quite a negative experience for young women going through things like arranged marriages, which is a part of the culture. And I'm not talking about forced marriages, but people, parents arranging marriages is still quite a common part of Asian culture, and girls in particular getting turned down for engagements because they happen to have darker skin than their sister, and their sister being the one that the family wants their son to marry, and that sort of thing. But then, having said that, on the same side, I was a teacher in South London, and most of my students down in South London were black, so particularly West African and Caribbean kids that I used to teach, and it much like the story you've just talked about with your experience there, Martin, that I didn't realize the extent to how they were treated in society, because that's not something that I necessarily, because of this colorism, because I'm Asian and my skin tone might be slightly lighter, or there might be slightly other stereotypes applied to me that weren't the same as what they were experiencing. Taking a group of teenagers through London on a school trip, the amount of times that they would get stopped by officials, whether it might be ticket inspectors on the buses or the trains, or even going to one of the museums. I remember taking them to the Science Museum once, and the security guards telling me that they were being unruly when they were just sat there having a laugh. The expectations on them to be, and these are young teenagers, so they would have, and they did tell me that they've had this all their life, when I explained to them how shocked I was. But it's internalized from such a young age, and they, to be frank, these kids were essentially being criminalized for just being themselves, and it's that is pretty deep.
I just want to move our conversation on to the extra things that you're involved in outside of your day jobs. And Nimerta, if I could come to you first, a little bit about the Black Organising Forum. Could you just talk us through what your involvement is there and the things that come out of that?
Absolutely. So National Education Union is one of the biggest teaching unions. We have a lot of members who are Black or Asian or from minority ethnic backgrounds. And so the Black Organising Forum, the word Black in that name means politically Black. So anybody that isn't white British who may have experienced racism. The organising forum is made up of representatives from around the country. So I sit on it as somebody from the northern region. So that's kind of the northeast and the very northwest sort of Cumbria kind of end of the country. Yeah. So I sit on that, and we do a lot of organising around campaigning for an anti-racist education, so anti-racist curriculum within school, but actually, really getting schools to, or providing the tools for schools to become anti-racist in their community, really. So not just looking at what our kids learning in the classroom. And then the work I'm doing in the northern region, it's an interesting region to do this work, because there aren't a lot of Black educators here. We are here though, we might be a minority, but we're here, and we want to shout loudly about this. But it's really highlighted the fact that actually communities with not so much diversity need to learn about anti-racism so much more than the communities that are more diverse. They're the ones that are the communities that aren't hearing enough about this. They might not be part of those echo chambers where they're hearing about anti-racism. So it's really highlighted to me how important it is, particularly up here in the north of England.
I guess that really segues nicely into the work that you do with Anti-Racist Cumbria, Anne-Marie.
Absolutely. So Anti-Racist Cumbria was formed in 2020. I moved here in beginning of 2020, and it was just before. So George Floyd happened. There was a sort of protest in Carlisle Town Centre went along, and I came away from that thinking I want to do something, but I don't know what. Janet, who's our CEO, was being interviewed on local news at the time and said the similar thing, want to do something, not sure what. So I got in contact with her. So we formed Anti-Racist Cumbria with the mission of, the very big mission of making Cumbria the first anti-racist county. We've got probably about 65 volunteers now. One of the reasons I wanted to join, because coming from London, which is obviously very diverse, I was a bit concerned about coming here where there wasn't going to be a lot of people who looked like me. But then because of the work that I do, I was really drawn to the fact that, that these were like-minded people. And one of the things I really love about it is that we get things done. It's not just talking. We've got a lot of black and brown members, but we've also got a lot of white members who are allies, and everyone's committed to the same thing. We're at different levels in terms of our understanding, but there's a real thing about learning. We're doing work with the police, Cumbria Constabulary. We're doing work with schools about making them more anti-racist, because some schools had said to us, well, we haven't got a problem here because we haven't got any black and brown students. Our thing was, well, those students that you have now are going to go out into the world where there's lots more people. So they need to understand that. So that was been really good. And we're just raising awareness. And it's also about myth busting, because we know the sort of negativity you hear around. So we've got a large Gypsy Roma traveller community. And again, there's been lots of negativity around that. So it's about, supporting all of those people and making a difference. It speaks to who I am.
Thinking about the future and thinking about how people might be able to take away some learning from the conversation that we've had on this episode. I'm just wondering whether there are any thoughts that you might have on A, representation in the workplace, and B, role models, and the importance that both of those aspects play for inclusive organisations.
Yes.
Just thinking about that representation for young people alone, that I was sort of talking to someone recently about a school that I went to where it was in quite a rural school in Northumberland, where a primary school kid, it was just an innocent, from the mouths of babes sort of thing, but the kid said to me quite openly, "You're the first non-white person I've ever met before." So bringing people into the classroom can have that powerful effect that, this young person sort of is aware that this is a multicultural country, but has never met anybody because they're living somewhere where they just haven't had access to that, to those communities. And then thinking about that wider in the workplace, the one thing that really struck me moving from London up to the northeast was just how few colleagues of colour I had around me, and actually how that really changed the way things felt. And I do appreciate that being an ethnic minority in a country means that's probably going to happen, that if you're not in London, or you're not in a diverse inner city, that is likely to happen, but it does change how you feel.
Where do you see things changing for the better on the race and ethnicity front?
Even sharing some of the experiences we've shared, I think there are more people who are willing to learn, are good people who get it. And sometimes doing this kind of work, you can sometimes forget that. So if you're confronted with a lot of negativity, you can kind of forget that there are some really good people out there. I'm an optimistic person by nature, so I kind of, it's challenging, but it's not all bad.
Yes, like you say, a lot of people mean well and who want to do well, but people are worried that they're going to say the wrong thing. Is it better for just people to ask the silly questions?
Yes, absolutely. Whenever I'm training, I'm always saying to people, it's okay to get something wrong. If you're not sure, ask. I'd rather you ask me than either don't say anything, don't communicate, or get it wrong and just, because we're human beings, so we get things wrong, but it's okay. So ask the question, and people on the receiving end of the question recognize the difference between when someone's just being really not very nice to actually this person doesn't really know or understand.
Yeah,
we kind of recognize that it's an uncomfortable conversation, and often there's this fear of getting things wrong, but yeah, to kind of add to that the hope that I have is I'm seeing more and more, and certainly with the young people that I work with, that more and more people are becoming more kind of, I don't know if emotionally literate is the right phrase, but kind of aware of themselves and aware of
intelligence. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. They're aware of the root cause of that uncomfortableness is actually because of their own maybe sense of inadequacy with not knowing how it might feel to experience racism. And that means that more people are willing to openly come to the table to have a conversation.
What can listeners in majority groups do to become anti-racist?
One is educate yourself, because it isn't the black or brown person's responsibility to educate on everything. Also, don't be afraid to call things out, even if you don't know the right words necessarily. Even if you just say, I just feel uncomfortable with what you just said or what you just did. And then the third one, which is kind of links to what I said before, is about don't ask somebody to justify.
Maybe there are things that might be in your biases that are internalized. I don't know if we want to call them unconscious bias that are racist. Like, accept that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can hate yourself for it, but like accepting it, owning that is the first step towards becoming anti-racist. A lot of people do this really because it helps to assuage that uncomfortable feeling that they have, rather than going into it with this complete open-hearted desire to go on that journey to become an anti-racist. Nobody is going to wake up one morning and be, okay, I'm an anti-racist now. It is an ongoing process. All of us are going through this. It's something that I'm going through all the time. There are lots of nuances of racism that I'm not aware of. And so it's accepting what your biases are, accepting what you don't know, and also being committed to the long journey, not just because the George Floyd stuff has resurfaced again and it's all in the media, so we're going to pay attention to it, but then we're going to forget about it in a few months' time. But actually having that long-term commitment and doing it as like a slow burn process, rather than it being like a sort of, short-term virtue signaling.
Particularly that one resonates with me, that as a white person, I have the luxury of being able to take off the anti-racist cloak if I want to and put it to one side. Somebody who is experiencing racism experiences 24/7. So if you're going to be anti-racist, you need to be doing it consistently. So to equip ourselves for the future, what information source or website, maybe a book or something, would you recommend to our listeners to learn more about racism or being anti-racist?
Renni, Eddo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race.
Yeah.
Another one was Natives by Akala. So powerful. I love him anyway, but so powerful. And then I read one recently, David Harewood, the actor. His book is Do I Belong Here? I'd need to check the title, but really, again, just describing, so partly from being a Black child growing up in 70s racist, sort of London, but also from a mental health perspective.
I'm actually going to go for some stuff on TV.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's Small Axe by Steve McQueen, which was on the TV last year. Brilliant miniseries. Absolutely, heavy hitting, but really it's a vital watch, really. And also at the moment, Channel 4 have a series all about partition. So the formation of Pakistan and Bangladesh 75 years ago. And I think for me, as a British Asian who's never really learned about this before, it's been a really eye-opening watch. So yeah, those two TV shows.
And I was just thinking, just to add to that, from a South Asian perspective, Empireland by Sathnam Sanghera.
I'd like to drop a further one into the mix, if I might, which is a book called Free to Soar, and it's by Pearn Kandola. It's a really good practical book for the workplace, for people in positions of management and leadership, for how to become much more racially inclusive. So we've reached the end of this episode. It's been fascinating to talk to both of you. So thank you very much, Anne-Marie Bainbridge.
Thank you.
And Nimerta Virdee.
Thank you.
Thank you. And here's my self-care tip.
White Skies Self-Care.
You're sat at your desk, you're stuck, or your mind is racing and you can't concentrate, or you feel overwhelmed. Well, it's time for a quick stop, regroup, refresh meditation. Start by having a little stretch and get into a relaxed seated position with your feet flat on the ground. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. First, focus on breathing. Notice how your breath enters your nose, travels down your throat and into your chest. Perhaps on your next breath, explore how your breath fills your stomach and the sensation of holding the breath for a few seconds before breathing out. And on your next breath, concentrate on fully emptying your lungs. Stay here with your breath for a while. Enjoy the sensation of just being. And if thoughts pop into your head, acknowledge them as just thoughts and let them go. You may notice areas of tension in your body as you sit in your chair. See if you can breathe into these, and if you can, allow these to soften and imagine them floating away as you breathe out. You can allow your breath to become more expansive and free to journey through your body. Imagine your breath as you breathe out travelling down your legs and through your feet and into the ground, and in reverse as you breathe in. Imagine your breath journeying through your arms, hands and fingers, or along your spine and through your neck and head. Stay here for a while, enjoying the sensations with curiosity and in a non-judgmental way. And when it's time to bring your attention back to your day, return to your breath and the sensation of breathing. Begin to notice a sensation of where your body touches your chair and your feet touch the ground, and perhaps start to tune into the noises around you. Have a little stretch, maybe circle your shoulders, and then slowly open your eyes. And remember, the stop, regroup, refresh meditation is here for you whenever you need it, and you don't have to wait until you're feeling overwhelmed.
White Skies Self-Care.
We've been delighted to have Anne-Marie Bainbridge and Nimerta Virdee as our guests on this episode, and we hope you found it enlightening, and thank you for listening.
We look forward to you joining us to listen on our other episodes, and here's a reminder about how you can get in touch and how to access the captioned version of this podcast.
Contact us at linktree/Wide Skies, where you can also find a link to the captioned version of this podcast.
And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Guy reads 2-2. Have a safe onward flight.
Wellbeing. Inclusion. Diversity. Equality. White Skies.
A podcast produced and edited by Memoir Consulting in collaboration with Bridgeborn Psychology.